Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, which was named by Poets and Writers a best book for writers. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, and today I am so happy to have Christie Tate with us, who is the author of the fabulous book, Group: How One Therapist and a Circle of Strangers Saved My Life. And we're going to get into it. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about Christie. She's an essayist and author who writes creative nonfiction and memoir. She's the author of the New York Times bestseller Group, which was a Reese's book club selection and has been translated into 19 languages. She is also the author of B.F.F, a memoir of friendship lost and found. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, McSweeney's Internet Tendency, and elsewhere. Her essays have been nominated for Pushcart Prizes, and Kiese Laymon selected her essay Promised Lands as the winner of the New Ohio Review's 2019 nonfiction contest. She writes about addiction, eating disorders, friendship, alienation, recovery, and her grandma's farm in Forreston, Texas. She grew up in Dallas and now lives in Chicago with her family. She has finally stopped telling people that she graduated first in her law school class. And please don't hate her because she has no pets. We do not hate you because you have no pets. So now let's talk Group. Wow. This is so interestingly crafted. I mean, it's your memoir. It's your story of where you were, where you started from in a really hard, lonely, dismal place, and where you ended up. There's just so much wonderful in here. Can you give a little synopsis of Group, just so everyone understands who has not been living under a rock and hasn't read it?
So Group is a memoir, and it's the story of how I found myself at the age of 28. I was in law school. I'd finished my first year. I was first in my class, and I was completely consumed with suicidal ideation. I knew how to pass tests, and I could be a baller lawyer and make a ton of money. But what I didn't know how to do was something that I was longing for more than anything my law degree would give me, which was intimacy, relationships, friendships. I didn't know how to get close to people. I had tried everything for 28 years and had no more good ideas and thought, I'm going to die alone. Maybe I'll be rich, but I am going to die alone. So I went to therapy and I ended up in group therapy, which I didn't know anything about. And it completely transformed my life. And it took so much longer than I wanted it to. And the riches were so much brighter and greater than I imagined. So it was certainly worth it. But it definitely was the back and forth roller coaster ride.
Great synopsis of your journey, which you lived and wrote about. And so you write this book in 3 parts, and each part represents a group that you were given entree to by the guru, Dr. Rosen, who really is the one who's responsible for putting all this in motion. Of course, it's you making it happen, but it's the facilitation of the support that you got in the group. You break it up into three parts. You start from a point of the inciting incident, which is the suicidal thoughts that you're having, which is a real compelling way to get into the story. Did you always know that this was how you were going to bring the reader into the story from the beginning?
I always knew there was something about that moment. I'm sitting in my car. It's the long holiday weekend. I just found out my class rank, and it was the first time I very clearly heard a voice in my own head say, maybe you'll just die. And that felt like a relief, and I was scared. So I knew that was a very important moment in my own narrative of myself. And I imagined that I would give that to readers. However, early on, I had a prologue. And I guess I just wanted to start a little happier place. The prologue ended up at the end of the book. I go with my fiance to my therapist's house to have dinner. And I thought that was an awesome prologue. And I remember the day that a woman in my writing group, Ann Falkowski, she's an amazing essayist, and she said, "You cannot start here. You've given it all away." And that had never occurred to me. And she was totally right. And from that day forward, it starts where it starts.
Interesting. Okay. So you wanted that to be the learning from the reader at the end.
Right. I decided just to go in a more chronological way and just take the readers with me as this young girl from Texas who's in Chicago and is so lost. Looks great on paper. I looked amazing on paper
Yeah.
and my insides were in shambles. And I wanted to take readers through, okay, I know I'm going to tell the story of my therapy journey. Where did it start? And truly, it started when I got scared enough to figure out how to get the money to get help. And it was that moment in a parking lot.
Wow. And so you go through really in a granular way each part of your journey of getting close to people.
Mm.
And there's an interesting timeline set up early on. You say something like 5 years. You want it to be fixed, have everything fixed in 5 years. And Dr. Rosen said something like, that can happen. I don't know if that's his exact words. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. She's putting a timeline on that. How did you make that decision to set up the timeline?
Narratively, I didn't know anything. When I started writing the book, I knew I was a great reader and I'd taken classes on the essay, but this book just kept calling to me and calling to me. So I didn't even understand that the ticking time bomb of the 5 years, which is actually true. I did tell Dr. Rosen, you've got 5 years to get me a boyfriend or I'm going to kill myself. That's what I said to him. Very, very subtle. And he didn't flinch. He was like, great. Okay. Well, you'll start group in 3 weeks. So looking back now, I know so much more about narrative. How smart of me to pick that ticking time bomb. I
Yes.
will say one very dumb thing I did was originally and forever, for months and months and months, until the very end when I got an agent. The name of this book was How to Fix Your Love Life in 800 Therapy Sessions. I thought that was so clever and so great. And I went to like a pitch fest and I'm talking to this famous agent about my book. And he stopped me the minute I said the title. He's like, you cannot use that title. And I said, why? And he said, if you have something like 800 in your title, people are going to be like, that's going to be so long and such a slog. It's a turnoff, like just mentally, even subconsciously, it's a turnoff. And so I scrapped the title that day because I was like, oh, you're right. He was like, you never want to have a number higher than what, 10 or 12. And 800 is just a no, just no. So I learned a lot along the way.
That's really good. And that you are open to taking it in
Yeah.
also.
Yes.
So a couple of things really struck out for me. It's almost like when you went through your journey, it was how to let people in. You were lonely, how to open up and let people in, and also dealing with the shame of suicidal ideations, of having the food eating disorder,
Yeah.
and not feeling worthy of love. And the prescriptions that Dr. Rosen gave, to me, Yes, that's what happened. But it's also a great writing structuring tool to have these prescriptions. So tell me how that worked in the actual plotting of the memoir.
So Dr. Rosen's method is madness, total madness. I still see him, so I can say that with great confidence. I've been there 20 years. And he's very into like creating bonds between group members, and he's not into pills. I was a binger, I had an eating disorder, and I was in a 12-step program, but it had not cured me of the parts of my eating disorder that kept me so isolated. So my very first prescription was to call a woman in my group at the end of every day and just tell her what I ate. And now I could tell you what I ate yesterday, and I can do that very freely. But at the time, I would have rather run naked through my law school. I was so ashamed of my eating, and there was so much of it that was out of control. It was a huge secret what I was doing with food, even though I was in recovery. So that was the first one. And to your point, as I went along, the prescriptions got scarier because once I could do food, well, then we were going to do a little something around some death experiences and some of my relationship to trauma, right? Okay, so that's scary. You cross that hurdle. And so now we're going to do some stuff around sex. And those were the big areas where I needed healing. I couldn't have done the sex and death until I dealt with the eating, which was every day in and day out. It's not that I cured my eating either. It was more that I let go of the shame and the secret. Then I was freed up for this energy. Okay, what else do I need to look at? I need to look at attachment and death and always back to sex. You know, these therapists love sex. And if you want to have a relationship and a family, I did. I wanted to have a relationship and a family, and I needed to do some sexual healing. I needed to figure out what was so inhibiting for me. And that was hard, hard work.
And there were a couple of, I see them as Easter eggs. I don't want to give everything away, but you mentioned one place and you mentioned it a couple times, like, ooh, there's going to be something having to do with that. And I thought that was clever. And tying in the sex also tied in with the transference of Dr.
Yes.
Rosen, which is a normal thing that happens in therapy. I've never done group therapy, but I'm a big advocate of therapy. And I've had a therapist for years, for decades. And I'm a big advocate of that because I think it helps rather than having to vent and tell everything to your friends.
Yes.
But what's so interesting is that this kind of no holds barred attitude was really what you needed because you were so locked in tight. And I understand because I had that upbringing, what parents said, hold it into yourself and don't share what makes you vulnerable. And it was very hard for me to learn to be vulnerable in relationship. So you learned that. And I think it's true. You learned it in group. You started with telling Marnie about the apples and revealing all that. And then you got to the sex. And then you got to diving into relationship, even dating people from different groups. It's sort of like it made me feel at one point when Dr. Rosen was giving a sex prescription. I thought, this is a little cult leaderish. And I'm
Yeah.
sure I'm not the first person who said that to you.
No, you are not. I have really enjoyed and appreciated readers' feedback. First of all, readers are so generous. They reach out to me, they tell me their therapy stories, they tell me how much they hate Dr. Rosen or they love Dr. Rosen or both, which really mirrors my own experience. And I learned early on when talking about the book to be very clear, this isn't for everyone. Dr. Rosen is not everyone's cup of tea. And even now, when I look back, I was so vulnerable when I went there. It doesn't matter what my chronological age was. I happened to be 28. I just turned 28 and I was so vulnerable. I would have done anything he said. And you can tell from the book, I did all these crazy things he said. And it was years before I saw and understood I could have said no. I could have said no to any of it. And I still would have gotten well because learning to say no is a skill that was later to come for me. I like to please. I like to please authority figures. My mentality always was if I'm going to pay for this wacky doctor to help me, I'm going to do everything he says. And many of my group mates come in and they're like, I am not doing that. And they get praised for pushing back. So to your point, there are many, many people and people who I used to be in group with who have since left. And it's tricky. We maintain a relationship. I mean, I don't have to cut ties or whatever, but it's tricky because they've had a falling out with a process and a person about whom I wrote a book and I'm still attached to. So I do get it. And I hope readers know that of all the things I've learned in group, the number one thing is you say your thing, I'll say my thing. And it's just great engagement, is intimacy.
That's intimacy. And I thought it was really important because I think as a society, we have problems understanding that the level of intimacy of a relationship is dependent on the ability to share and process negative emotions.
Yes.
And the stronger you are and the stronger a partner that you are going to butt heads. The people that tell me they never fight with their partner, they are completely copacetic, I say there's limitations and there's not a true deep intimacy. Not everybody wants that. You wanted it, I wanted it, but you have to do the work to get there, and everyone gets there in their own way. It's how you navigate the fighting. I grew up in a house where they fought and there wasn't resolution. It would be like you'd
Ooh.
fight and everything would be ripped apart until you would heal. And that's not how it happens now. So it's so important. What you're saying and how you shared your journey, it's really vulnerable, but it's brave. And it probably because you got stronger through the process and you also found your partner, it probably doesn't feel as vulnerable as maybe people look at you and go, oh, you're so vulnerable, because you're not. You were then.
Right. I mean, by the time I wrote the book, I was 10 years out from the events that I was writing about. So it had cooled for me. It's red hot for a reader who doesn't know me and hasn't lived through it. For me, it was cool enough to have some distance from the shame. Just to be clear, there are some mornings, not very often, but maybe 3 times a year, I wake up and I think, did I write all that down and put it in a book that people can read? And I'll just sort of like shake my head, like, that was weird. I can't believe I did that. I don't regret it, but I still feel like there are moments where I'm like, that was really part of it. Part of the bravery came from I just never thought anyone would read it. That's a sort of a mechanism, a denial. Plus, I know plenty of writers who have books in trunks. I have plenty of books in trunks. I didn't know what group was going to become, who was going to hold it up in an Instagram post. I didn't know Reese Witherspoon would ever know my name. I was writing my writing project and doing the best I could. And maybe I would help someone, and then that would be that. And I'd go on to something else. And that sort of was a good cover psychologically for how naked I truly was in this book.
Wow. And how did the Reese thing happen? Somebody gave it to her, just her acquisitions group, or for a
Yeah,
book club?
she has an amazing team of readers, and I'm sure every publisher in the world sends her their books that they would love to be considered. So I was just living my life, working on my next thing, and I get a call, and my editor's on the phone, and she said, "Well, Reese Witherspoon has picked your book as her October book club pick." And I was like, "Oh my God, what? Like, that's crazy." And this was in July. So it took all that time for me to like wrap my head around what was happening to this little blue book of mine, and always such gratitude and also just thunderstruck by the whole thing.
And did she ever tell you what it was that pulled her to your book? What it was?
Yeah, we ended up doing like a Zoom that lives somewhere on the internet. But what she said to me, which was so, it was the most moving thing. And other readers have said it, but there's just something about Reese Witherspoon talking to you with her beautiful teeth and her wonderful Southern accent. And she says, This was so relatable. We have all been there." And she didn't specify. I was like, "You've done the things I've done." What I understood her to be saying was that for those of us who come of age, who look great on paper and we've had some success in one area of our lives, but we're still lonely and disconnected in a way where we really want to be connected, there is work to do. And on the road to having the relationships we want, many of us, certainly me included, have relationships that aren't that great and don't feel that good and don't serve us and don't nourish us. And there's something universal in my story that she said I tapped into. It would have never occurred to me that anyone, certainly an A-lister, would be like, your story resonated with me. It still makes me laugh. And I'm very grateful. it was a wonderful surprise from the universe.
And how long did it take to write the book?
That's a great question. I spent about 4 years writing it. At the time, I had 2 school-aged children, and I worked full-time as a lawyer at a government agency, and I wrote when I could, and it was certainly not a full-time job. The most I ever wrote in one day was 3 hours, and that was very remarkable. Mostly I wrote in 30-minute increments at lunch, in the morning, in the evening, on weekends. So it took about 4 years to get it all down. And then I spent a year sort of editing, stepping away from it, coming back, and then we sold it after that. So door to door from starting to selling it was like 5 years.
Wow. And do you feel that you write faster now, or the process works faster now that you've done it a couple of times? What do you feel?
That's a great question. So I'm working on something now and I'm working with my agent, and I want to say it's more ambitious because it's not just my story. The thing about writing a straight memoir is I have all the information, I lived through it. Yes, I have some journals and I have some documents, but there was not a lot of research that went into group. I have an awesome memory. I still go to group and I have these journals, and that's the universe of the story. And now I'm working on something that's like a little bit my story. There's a little bit of a family, and then there's a biographical aspect. So I'm juggling more things, and it feels like I'm going faster and it's taking longer. How is that possible? I don't know. There's a paradox in there because I think I'm trying to learn a new skill. The part of my writing that I think that comes the most natural, brings the most joy is this voicey thing I have where I'm sort of just like, say it plainly. I mean, I don't have an MFA, so no one taught me to write pretty. I just write like I write, kind of like a smart aleck, and it's self-deprecating, whatever. How do I bring that voice when I'm talking about someone else's life? Right now, I feel like I'm producing all these drafts and I'm sending them to my agent, and she's saying, okay, this is good, but now try this. So I've generated a lot, and it feels like I'm not sure what I have to show for myself, which is what any writer has to go through. But there is a paradox in here where I feel like I'm producing quickly and not sure how close I am to the finish line, which would be essentially sell a proposal for my next work.
Right. Because you're learning as you go. And so your next
Mhm.
work is not memoir. It has elements of memoir, but it's not memoir.
It probably sits on the memoir shelf, but it's really a creative nonfiction where I'm talking about somebody's life, somebody I've never met who's a figure in history, plus a little bit of my parents and then me. And it's so fun to do something new. The only downside is my ego wants to go faster. My ego wants a Publishers Weekly announcement. My ego wants more, 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 all this attention I got from group and my second book, B.F.F. It's like, that has nothing to do with writing or writing the right book. Every writer knows that. So there's the battle that rages behind the scenes is like ego and time
Right.
versus serving the story and getting it right.
Yeah. It's really about getting it right and getting it the way that you know it needs to be. And then probably things go faster. That's what I
Yes.
imagine. So do you feel like people tell you, oh, with memoir, it has to have a how-to aspect? I don't believe that because yours, it did have some prescriptive things because anyone could learn something. They could be like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I won't go to group, but I'll have my best friend give me prescriptions, telling me to do something. Yell at your boyfriend and see how he reacts and have a fight and see how that resolves. I mean, that could happen.
Absolutely. I definitely didn't have any aspirations to be prescriptive or to tell people how to. And every now and then I'll walk into a bookstore. I never look for my books because that feels so self-indulgent. But my kids will be like, Mom, you're in the self-help section. And I'm like, ooh, I don't think of myself as self-help at all. But to your point, the only place where I felt like there was pressure to be how to was on the back end with publicity because articles and women's magazines and all kinds of influencers, they want your takeaways. What does Christie Tate say about how to get well in group therapy? Which is not the tone or the purpose or the mission of the book at all. But on the back end, if somebody doesn't want to go to group, what principles can they take? Which I surely would share. I mean, they're all over the book and I can definitely distill them, but that wasn't the project and the making of this work.
Right. But you also gave a lot of great details. I mean, you didn't shy away from talking when you talked about your odd diet when you had the eating disorder. I mean, I'm still thinking of the water packed tuna, mustard, and green cabbage, I think you said. I mean, no one should adhere to that, but the idea is you were very specific. And I think the specificity all throughout your book really does paint a picture for the reader, and I think it's important, especially when you're talking about a world that maybe not everybody knows, not everybody has experience with eating disorder. They may know people, but just learning about it, not in how to do it, but just
Right.
the details that are related to the story. I think it's so useful.
It's so interesting, this topic of the detail and all the specificity in my writing, because that was a place where writing and therapy absolutely overlapped. When you go into group and you tell a story, if you tell it really vaguely, it's harder to get help. And I got lots more positive reinforcement when I was like, it was 9 o'clock. This guy came over. And if I set the scene in group, then Dr. Rosen and my group mates would understand a little bit of my history and state of mind. And so I've set the scene. I would get better results in therapy. So when I started writing and I would get feedback like, I can't see the scene here. You're doing too much summary. You're telling, please show us. I was like, oh, it's the same skill that helped me get well in therapy that I need in writing. And what holds me back is a sense of like some shame. So I'm like, this is gonna be so boring. If I tell you what these lunches are, some of it's shame because I knew I was eating very wacky food. And some of it's like, isn't it boring? And I cannot tell you the people who reach out to me who are like, I will never look at an apple the same way after reading your story. And I just laugh. And people have reached out to me, people in the binge world, not everybody's a binger, but people who have weird, not weird, but like aberrant food behavior that may be actually just fine on paper, but it's a secret, so they feel shame about it. The people who reach out to me about their food ruts or habits or obsessions, I would never have those conversations had I not written about exactly what I did with food that was so distressing to me.
And I like that you make that correlation that that is really what helped you in therapy, being a storyteller, because it's like competing. You had all those people in group, they all want to tell their story. If
Yes.
somebody said, "Oh, Bob came over last night and we fooled around, but he didn't hug me." And you're like, "Bob came over. He,
Right.
drank till he fell asleep snoring on me, and then I felt him lean over." I mean, you're telling a story, you're painting a picture, and so your group is probably, "Yeah, what happened, and how can we help?"
Totally.
That's so interesting, and then you take that and you bring it to your work. I mean, I'm sure you get this all the time, Christy. People want to tell their stories. What advice do you give them in terms of the writing? We all know you have to sit down, you have to get it out, whether it's your first draft, vomit draft, whatever you want to call it. But what can they do, especially when they feel stuck?
Yeah, the best piece of advice I got was from Anne Falkowski. She gave me some advice. This was long before I was a published author. I was at work and I had 1 hour to spare. I had a free hour and I couldn't decide what to work on. And it had become a block. Should I work on this memoir I'm working on or an essay? Or should I just read something or read a craft book? Or what should I do? And I was spinning out. And my friend Anne said to me, and this is advice I use every single day I write, including this morning. She said, go where the heat is. Instead of what you think you should do, what you think you can sell, any of that, where's the heat? And she's like, where is it in your body? Feel it in your body and put it on the page. To this day, I can still spin out. Spinning out is a very easy thing to do for me. So when I'm like, oh, should I work on this essay that I was going to do for my writing group? Should I work on that scene where I'm listening to my dad tell me a story? I feel the heat. I feel the enthusiasm rising. If I can just see one tiny tip of it, right? We all know we have to build a mountain, but sometimes you can only see a tip or a tree or a chipmunk on the edge of a cliff. Start where the heat is and just start moving the pin based on what is calling you, what's hot to you, what wants you as much as you want it. And even if it's just a tiny bump in temperature, that is the universe or your body or something is pointing you that direction. feed that kindling and it will get bigger. That's been my experience for over 10 years.
I love that. And I want to go back to your very beginning when you talk about your unscored heart.
Yes.
Can you explain a bit about that and how it sort of became your through line and you end
Yes.
with a scored heart?
Absolutely. It's so funny because this came from I took a pottery class. I'm not very artsy, but I took a pottery class in high school. If you're putting a candle on a mug, right, a piece of pottery, in order for it to fire and really fuse together, both sides have to be scored. So like you have to put like hatch marks both on the cup you made and on the handle, and then you smush it together. So in the heat of the kiln, they bond instead of repel each other. And the first few pieces I made, I refused to score them because I thought it was ugly. I thought it was like messing with my art I had just made. And every time we'd go, we'd open the kiln, and sure enough, my handle would have exploded or broken apart and wasn't attached to my cup because I refused to score it. And I thought, even back then, I was 15 years old when I took that class. Once I started dating and realized how much trouble I was having, I always felt like my heart was that slick, pristine cup that I didn't want to mess up. And the hatch marks that would come on my heart would come from having a fight or disagreeing or setting a boundary, all things I didn't want to do. I didn't want to mess up my perfect cup. And guess what? People did not attach to me. I didn't attach to them because I wouldn't do the quote messy work required for attachment. And I'd already written the book. I was probably 3 years into the project, maybe four. I mean, it came in the final stretch. I was like, oh, maybe that belongs in the book. I remember I was standing on a Stairmaster in some corporate hotel, which is like a disgusting, it's not scenic in any way. And I'm like on a Stairmaster before a deposition. And I thought to myself, I have thought this about my heart my whole life. And it makes complete sense to me. Maybe it would be helpful to readers. And then my first thought was to push that away. Like, that sounds hard. How am I putting that in my book? My book is done. And then I was like, what if I just try? And then I found a spot for it at the beginning. And then I said, oh, I can sprinkle it here, here, and here. It really just works because it was very authentic. It was very organic and people really respond to it. When I got into the editing process with my editor who bought the book and was going to put it out, she took a few of them out. She's like, you don't need to hammer this quite as hard as you are. It was easy to take it out. But I do recall the idea came to me, and my first thought was no. And then my second thought was, I'll try.
I'm so glad you did because I think the brain, when we're reading, we look for things to like grab onto. That's why the power of through lines in books is so compelling. It is with an essay as well, but a book is much harder because it's a longer form. There's a longer place to go to. So it's understandable that she wanted to take a few out, but you still have that through line throughout. And it's really satisfying because you are in a different place and it works as a metaphor and it also works as a map in a way.
Yes, I did learn. I took some classes with the writer Lydia Yuknevich. She has a whole thing, corporeal writing. She's the first person to teach me about the power of an image, like a figurative, a literary image, some anchor, like you said. And that's what the scored heart was. I would repeat it and it would accrue. Each time I used it, it accrued more meaning. And it was something for readers to hold on to as I'm going through all these sexual and therapeutic escapades.
Yeah, and it's really quite a journey. Is it something that you want to become a movie?
That's so
Perhaps in the
funny.
universe, if that's what it is.
Yes, Reese Witherspoon's company, Hello Sunshine, bought the rights. It was so exciting. I was like, "Oh my god, oh my god." I listen to a lot of podcasts where writers talk or go to a lot of writing or author talks, and so many of them was like, "Oh, Hollywood, it moves so slow. Hollywood will break your hearts." And I was like, "Not me. Reese Witherspoon bought my book." I mean, I don't think anything much is happening with it. To the best of my ability, I hold open the possibility that it could become a movie, a Netflix thing, or whatever, starring Jennifer Lawrence and Seth Rogen. I don't know. So I hold it out as a possibility without being attached to the outcome because I do think that's a recipe for some disappointment and impatience.
Yeah. Yeah. They always say creatively, it's always good to like think of your next project or be working on your next project, which it sounds like that's what you're doing. And a lot of times the universe will return something that you put out there,
Yes.
then just don't drown it.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. Yes.
This is wonderful. This has been such a pleasure speaking with you about group and about the process. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you want to share?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm just so grateful for your engagement around the writing process. I really love letting people know that none of it's easy and there are little anchors, little lights along the way. The number one thing I would say for any aspiring writers, if you're truly blocked and you don't feel any heat anywhere, for lots of reasons it can be blocked, be a reader. Take your writing time and read and read and read. That really has gotten me through my darkest times. After Group came out, I had this incredible success. I did not dream that big, literally didn't dream that big. And, eventually the dust settles, things get quiet. People stop calling Christie Tate about Group. And I had such a depression, such a deep depression. Like I've peaked. It was just very scary. There's a postpartum, there's a dopamine drop, all of the things. And I couldn't write. I kept my protected writing time and I just read and I let other people's words carry me until I could find my own heat again. I saw the very, very famous writer, Lauren Groff, who's always on Obama's list with all her books, Fates and Furies and The Matrix. And I saw her speak, and she's so prolific and so beautiful and so successful as a writer and a person. And she said, I write 1 hour a day and I read about 500 books a year. And I was like, thank you. That is my instinct. Be a reader first. Let yourself be a reader, and the writing will come. That's something I like to tell writers.
That is beautiful advice to end this on. And I thank you so much.
Thank you, Estelle. This was absolutely such a fun conversation.
Follow me at estelleserasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.